Remember the food pyramid? There used to be one in pretty much every health practitioner's office in the 90s. All the yummy stuff like fats and sweets at the top under used sparingly, then cheese, more vegetables, and lots of bread and pasta at the bottom. It was invented in Sweden in the 70s, endorsed by the US in the 90s for public dietary advice, and my Kiwi colleagues tell me it filtered down to New Zealand's walls too. Now it's been turned upside down, literally, by RFK Jr., the man whose health advice includes these gems.
Because the MMR vaccine contains a lot of aborted fetus debris and DNA particles. The causative association with between Tylenol given in pregnancy and the perinatal periods is not sufficient to say it definitely caused autism, but it is very suggestive. COVID-19 is targeted to attack Caucasians and black people. The people who are most immune are Ashkenazi Jews and Chinese.
We've talked about him before on The Detail, when his thoughts on Panadol, autism, and vaccines went viral for the wrong reasons. And this is why we're talking about him again. Because when US health authorities issue changed advice, such as these updated set of dietary guidelines that came out in January, the world takes notice. I'm Gwen McClure, and today on The Detail, the controversial changes, how they affect us, and whether we can trust the science coming out of RFK Jr.'s office. Today, I'm talking to Nikki Bezant, a journalist who writes about health and food, and dietitian, author, and professor of nutrition at AUT, Karen Zinn.
Look, I don't think they've done themselves a service by flipping it. Our philosophy was we need to flip the food pyramid in our philosophical thinking about what's at the bottom, what's at the top, but not. I think what they've done is they've actually visually flipped it, which has added a little bit of the confusion.
Some background first. The old pyramid had bread and pasta at the bottom with 6 to 11 servings a day. Veggies and fruit were above that with about half as many servings. Then milk, yogurt, poultry, meats, beans, and nuts at 2 to 3 servings a day. And at the top, fats, oils, and sweets. Now, some 30 years later, not only has the food moved around, but the pyramid has been turned on its head with the pointy bit at the bottom. Meat and cheese are right at the top, but the top is now the big bit, so protein has been prioritized. Whole grains are in the same place, but the bottom is now really small. Where are the sugary treats? Gone. Also out, highly processed foods, ditched in favor of whole food that's good for the gut. And full fat is back. Confused? Karen, please explain.
Yeah, so the American Dietary Guidelines were first established around 1980. They're legally bound to develop guidelines, to update them every 5 years. And one of the main purposes of the guidelines is to then inform the food programs that exist in different institutions. So like the school food programs, so rest homes and other institutions that supply food on a partial or fully supplied basis to different population groups. And I think the most interesting point about these guidelines is that this is really the first time that they've had very, I would say, extraordinary changes to them compared to what we've seen every year since the 1980s.
All right. So your top line takeaway on this, change is good or bad?
Look, I think the change is good. And I guess you're talking to someone who has been trying to advocate for a lot of these things for the last 12 years of my career. Yes, it's not perfect. I don't think we'd ever really get dietary guidelines perfect because, people are coming from different perspectives and there's so many influences involved. But I actually think there is largely very, very positive change here.
Can you walk me through what those changes are, like what the good stuff in here is?
The first thing that I'll focus on is that there's a real emphasis on whole, real food. And we're not saying that there wasn't necessarily an emphasis on whole food last time, but this time it's really clear, and it's written throughout the document about ultra-processed foods, keep those really low or remove them altogether, even looking at removing things like additives and dyes and all that kind of stuff. So that is something that we've never really heard of or seen before, is the sort of micro level detail about ultra processed foods. And that has stirred up a little bit of debate, as nutrition always does, because ultra processed foods, they don't have an explicit definition that everyone agrees with, that it includes sort of healthier foods that have lots of things added to them that are okay. As an example, protein powder and Tim Tam biscuits are lumped together,
Okay.
Alongside that, there's an emphasis on the fact that no amount of added sugar is good. Another real plus is there is a specific guideline change on protein. So the protein RDA, or recommended daily allowance, in the States, or in New Zealand, it's referred to as the recommended daily intake. Protein has always been around 0.8 grams per kilogram per day. I don't think there's a lot of contentious thought about the fact that it's woefully underrepresenting what we should be having, because that's really set to prevent deficiencies. Now, we don't want to go through life preventing, protein deficiencies. We're talking about what's a healthy diet, what's optimal. And this guideline actually sits on 1.2 to 1.6 grams per kilogram per day. And that's essentially almost double. It's double what the protein guideline is. So it's pushing protein, which I think is a really good thing for a whole host of reasons. There is also an emphasis, and this sits alongside the protein guideline, there's an emphasis on animal protein foods, which is really, really interesting, considering the move towards, the whole plant-based movement from a, I guess, dare I say, climate change perspective or environmental perspective. There is an emphasis on animal protein foods, and that's really the steer towards optimal nutrition. Nobody debates the fact that a plant-based diet is not as nutrient replete as an animal-based diet. There is attention to the nutrients of concern that actually gets called out for the first time in these guidelines as well for people who are vegetarian or vegan. There's a bit of a de-emphasis on grains. The serving sizes, which always used to be between 6 and 11 servings per day, have now been reduced to between 2 and 4 per day, which is a massive change.
So what about fats? What does it say about fats in these new guidelines?
Dietary fats have been debated for years and years and years. And over the last 10 years, there's been a lot more science that has come out and a lot more debate around types of fats and fat substitutions. And this is the first set of guidelines to actually emphasize healthy fats in reference to things like butter and tallow alongside olive oil, which was always, heralded as a healthy fat. But they've also basically said have full fat dairy products and have full fat animal-based protein foods. In the old days, they would go cut the fat off the meat, take the skin off the chicken. We need to go low fat. We need to go lean meats. There's none of that. There is actually a push towards eating whole foods with the fat on, natural fats, and referring to those fats as being healthy fats, which is really where a lot of the controversy comes in, because the whole saturated fat heart disease relationship, which is the kind of historical mantra, that's where the pushback is. And these guidelines reflect that to a certain perspective, because your next question might be, well, then why have they retained the 10% saturated fat guidelines, limits? So I think this is where a lot of the critique comes in. You're seeing a push of a full-fat animal protein foods or full-fat dairy, and the mention of the word butter and tallow with reference to healthy fat. And then they're going, but then you need to keep your saturated fat intake at 10% of your total calories.
Yeah,
and
so
the reality is, yeah.
Oh, just to clarify that. So it says, in general, saturated fat consumption should not exceed 10% of total daily calories. Significantly limiting highly processed foods will help meet this goal. More high-quality research is needed to determine which types of dietary fats best support long-term health. So there's still a bit of question over that, isn't there?
Yeah, I think the saturated fat argument will carry on. Um, some of the researchers and advocates that are pro saturated fat and think that saturated fat has no bearing on heart disease whatsoever are a little bit upset that that has not been removed as part of these guidelines. But I do think it's a move towards it, and probably the next set of guideline change in 5 years' time, I would imagine that cap is going to be removed. But that is the kind of hot topic here, and I think it's because it's dietary context and the whole food actually matters. So I think that people would probably agree that in the context of a whole food, low refined carbohydrate diet, if you have higher levels of saturated fat, it's likely harmless in terms of contributing to heart disease. But saturated fat in the context of a high calorie, high sugar, high carbohydrate diet, in other words, the cream on the donut as opposed to the butter cooking the eggs, like that sort of diet is absolutely toxic and what we refer to as the standard American diet. So it's the context of what's the context of food and diet in general, where saturated fat becomes a more complex conversation.
So I guess my takeaway then is that if you're following this advice, you need to kind of follow it wholesale. But if you do that, is it actually possible to add in all the beef tallow and the steak and the eggs and, so on and so forth to get your protein, but still keep that saturated fat consumption below 10%?
Highly unlikely.
Okay.
Highly unlikely. And that's where the disconnect is.
The saturated fat issue is not the only area where the guidelines have been controversial. Here's Nikki Bazant.
I think that what's happened here with these guidelines is that you've got a bit of a collision of evidence-based science and an ideology that doesn't necessarily fit that.
What have you been reading in terms of the reaction to these new guidelines?
Yeah, I think there's been a fair amount of acknowledgement that some of this is good. Some of the stuff is good and needed to be changed. I mean, it's good to emphasize whole foods. It's good to emphasize protein, less ultra-processed foods, all that kind of thing is good. But then certain things have been chucked in there to support beliefs rather than necessarily evidence-based science. Robert Kennedy Jr. is someone who is a known anti-vaxxer. He believes a number of conspiracy theories, and he's got his own views around health. And that has made its way into these guidelines, it looks very much like.
Can you speak at all to what the process was in putting this together? I have seen something about whether the people who put it together sort of followed appropriate scientific process and rigor in doing so.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. The process for the dietary guidelines in America is pretty rigorous, and it actually takes years and years. And it's been happening the same way for decades. It's pretty rigorous. What they have is this Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, which spends several years putting together a scientific report which has recommendations in it for the guidelines to be written. So that was all done. And that was released in December 2024. And that committee is independent. They're appointed, they're outside of government, they're completely independent. And that report that they produce is then open to public feedback. And then the HHS and the USDA in America creates the guidelines from all of that process. So that all happened this time, or at least the first half of that happened, but they didn't actually really use that to create the guidelines this time. They formed a new committee called the Scientific Foundation for the Dietary Guidelines for Americans, and that was a fairly opaque process. So that was it was written by some hand-picked people who were all, as it turns out, aligned with beef, dairy, protein supplement industry interests. And it's unclear exactly how they got to where they got to with the guidelines. They actually rejected half of the recommendations in that original report, and they haven't really explained that adequately of why they did that. So they claim to focus on gold standard science, but actually their justifications are lacking, at least according to nutrition experts and certainly nutrition bodies around the world. There was an article published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, which really criticised the guidelines and said it represented a regression in evidence-based public health policy, and actually have called for them to be withdrawn and rewritten, which is pretty strong. The Centre for Science and the Public Interest has published a really good sort of piece on their website, and they say, criticising the process, really. So they say that by discarding a rigorous, transparent scientific process in favour of an opaque and conflicted one, the guidelines undermine the scientific integrity of federal nutrition policy and risk steering Americans towards dietary patterns that increase rather than reduce chronic disease. So that's also really strong. They're saying it's going to do harm and not help. There's a lot of stuff around the guidelines diverging from the evidence and the facts and equity. And that was a thing that the new kind of committee actually said specifically, that they didn't like the focus of the original scientific report on health equity, which is quite weird.
Yeah, I don't really understand.
No, but it fits with the ideology. It fits with the ideology of the Trump administration in general. And it certainly fits with RFK Jr.'s approach to health, which is that it is all down to the individual and not about systemic issues, which we know not to be true in terms of health.
That's pretty damning to actually say that you don't like an approach.
I know. I was shocked to read that, but they specifically say that the focus on health equity was not appropriate, or they didn't like it. So they've ignored all of that. So probably that's why the 50% of things they rejected were probably related to health equity, among other things.
So how much does this sort of guideline coming out of America affect New Zealand?
It's unclear, really. I don't think it'll affect the policymakers here in New Zealand that much, but it might certainly affect people's attitudes and eating behaviours, because we are all consuming the same content. This stuff is everywhere out there on social media, and, it's gonna sort of filter through into eating behaviours and attitudes, I would suggest. But our guidelines are certainly different from these guidelines in terms of what is recommended for us to eat and how we should eat.
But it's funny, I wouldn't really know what our guidelines are here.
Yeah, the irony is that most people, and this probably is true around the world, don't follow official guidelines anyway, and certainly in America they do not. So it's funny that people will criticise past guidelines and use them as the reason for Americans being unhealthy. But the truth is that vast majority of people do not follow those dietary guidelines. And it's true in New Zealand as well. We know that less than 10% of us eat the recommended servings of vegetables a day, 5 to 6 servings.
But then at the same time, it probably trickles into the way that we think about food, and the way that we think about food trickles into the guidelines. But it's not completely insignificant.
The danger is probably that people just take the simple messages away, right? And the simple message out of this American guideline is that image. And it's just, hey, eat more steak and butter, woohoo. And so if people go away and do that, and they keep on eating their refined grains and their high-fat diet and their high sugar and their high salt, then no one's getting healthier from that.
I asked Karen the same question I asked Nikki. How much do these guidelines impact the way that we think and eat here in New Zealand?
I think that what the Americans do in terms of guidelines usually dictates what happens around the rest of the world. We don't look to them for the guidelines, but it sort of filters down. I don't know what's going to happen with the filtering down from this set of guidelines, because they are so extraordinarily different and controversial. I'm not feeling hugely optimistic that there will be like a domino effect and all the guidelines will change. I think probably around the rest of the world, there'll be status quo with guidelines, but there'll be a lot more conversation, which is good. It's a good start.
And it's not just that they're so different, right? I mean, it's also that they're coming from RFK Jr.'s office. And I think that, we've got an issue there with how much we can trust the science coming from his office, right? I mean, and whether or not you...
Yeah, and that is a travesty, because the people on the committee that provided the evidence are top scientific researchers, and it's a shame that they can only get the voices of her that are pushing metabolic health and, food is medicine and lifestyle is medicine. The only way that they're getting heard is through this Trump administration sort of health, department, which is seen by a lot of people to be a bunch of nutters, which is a real shame. And I really think we need to try and put what we believe and what we trust about RFK Jr. I'd love to say we need to put that aside and actually focus on this because it's evidence-based, but I know that's not going to happen. So that's the biggest problem. People are going to look at these guidelines and go, oh gosh, it's part of that group, which are all nutters. So it's meaningless. And that is problematic.
How much does the actual nutrition, the nutrient density of foods come into play for you when you're making recommendations? And how much is it about other things, culture and affordability of foods, accessibility of foods, that sort of thing?
Yeah, that's a good point. And it's a juggle. I think there is a difference between individual health and population health. And I think having guidelines, guidelines are always going to be attacked because they don't address everyone's needs, right? And when I'm working one-on-one with an individual, I take all those things into account. The top of my list is nutrient sufficiency to tick that box and to allow the individual to meet their goal would mean that all the things that are important to them would need to come to the conversation, like culture, like accessibility, like affordability, like, family, chance of adherence, all that behavior change stuff, all that kind of stuff comes into a conversation. That kind of stuff doesn't come into guidelines because guidelines is like one document for a healthy population. Well, sort of take it with a pinch of salt in a way. Apart from the fact that it feeds all the food supply to some of these institutions, which
is probably important. I mean, I suppose the question is if this guideline is written for policymakers, and to inform what's being fed to people, who are part of these programs and part of these institutions that you're talking about. There probably does need to be some balance there, but also I suppose ideally we want the very best nutritional take and then do with that what you will, right?
Yeah, there are dietary guidelines. So if you promote a diet that's going to be nutritionally substandard, well, you haven't met that goal, have you?
That's all for today. The Detail is a newsroom production supported by RNZ and New Zealand On Air. Thanks to Karen Zinn and Nikki Bazant for talking to me. This episode was produced by Lexi Russell and Charlize Tansey and engineered by William Saunders. I'm Gwen McClure. Ka kite anō.